Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. We've got a number of members here, and I think that is really excellent. The topic is extreme risk laws, sometimes referred to as red flag laws. I strongly believe that these are important tools that can empower family members and law enforcement to ask courts to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. They should at least include requiring universal background checks, closing the Charleston loophole, which would give law enforcement more time to complete checks, and hopefully banning assault weapons. To be clear, extreme risk laws are a vital part of that effort. As of today, as the chairman said, we have 14 states and the District of Columbia passing extreme risk laws. The states are Connecticut, Indiana, my state, California, Washington, Oregon, so you have the Pacific Coast, Florida, Vermont, Maryland, Delaware, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Illinois, and New York. I've introduced the Extreme Risk Protection Order of 2019, which would create new grants to incentivize states taking similar measures to prevent gun violence. The national discussion about extreme risk laws, or red flag laws as called, escalated after 17 people lost their lives in Parkland, Florida. It was one of the deadliest school shootings in our history. We know the shooter had troubling signs before the shooting. Those signs didn't go unnoticed. In September 2017, the FBI was alerted to a comment the young man made on an online video that said, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." That's a direct quote. In January of 2018, the FBI got another tip about this young man's gun ownership, desire to kill people, erratic behavior, and disturbing social media posts, as well as the potential of his conducting a school shooting. Then nothing was done. A month later, he walked into Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, armed with an AR-15, took 17 lives, and wounded 17 others. While law enforcement could have done more, this young man's family could also have helped if they had been legally able to do so. And that's one reason why Florida acted quickly after Parkland to pass an extreme risk law. More should be done to address the daily toll gun violence is taking on our country. And I hope my colleagues here today will join me in doing more after today. Since 1994, background checks have stopped more than 3.5 million felons, domestic abusers, and other prohibited people from purchasing firearms. Yet 22% of all gun sales are being carried out without a background check. 90% of Americans support universal background checks. That's for everybody. So why are we not doing the same? Compared with the 10-year period before the 1994 federal assault weapons ban, the number of gun massacres between 94 and 2004, when the assault weapons bill was in law, the number of massacres fell by 37%. The number of people dying from gun massacres fell by 43%. And the fact is that the assault weapons ban worked. Extreme risk laws also work. San Diego has had particular success with California's law. In a little more than a year, that office has obtained 126 orders and confiscated 318 guns, including 33 assault weapons. I'd like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, a letter from the San Diego City Attorney. Here is an excerpt from that letter, and I quote, Our office has found California's red flag law to be a powerful tool for protecting residents and police officers from senseless gun violence. Gun rights advocates closely monitor our work. They have yet to bring to our attention a case where they believe the law was improperly granted, end quote. I thought that the Sandy Hook shooting was a moment when Congress would step up and take action, and I so hoped we would. Despite our best efforts, gun safety legislation was not enacted. Similarly, we saw no action after Parkland, after Las Vegas, or after the many other massacres our country has had to cope with. Unlike the United States, other countries did not miss the opportunity to do something. In Australia, in 1996, 35 people were killed when a gunman opened fire with 2 semi-automatic assault rifles. Shortly thereafter, Australia banned all assault rifles and put in place a licensing system. Now, just days after 50 people lost their lives in New Zealand, that country has also moved to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. So I am hopeful, I guess hope carries eternally, that Congress will once again find the courage to do what's right. We can't forget what happened in Parkland, Thousand Oaks, Isla Vista, Sandy Hook, Las Vegas, Sutherland Springs, Columbine, and countless other cities across the country where gun violence has taken so many lives. We've seen and we continue to see the cost of inaction. So this is a step. It's not a big step. It's a small step. It's a sensible step in the right direction. And I hope my Republican colleagues will join me and support the Extreme Risk Protection Order Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I forgot that in March of 2018, the Trump administration called on every state to enact extreme risk protection orders, and they've been trying to provide technical assistance to all those who step forward. So I thought that was something very noteworthy by the president.
Right.
So our panel is Mr. Ronald Hamburg. Is that right, sir? Yes. Senior Policy Advisor, National Alliance on Mental Illness. Miss Amanda Wilcox, who I think's family suffered a violent crime episode, and sorry about your daughter's terrible thing. Man was mentally ill, came into the mental health facility where your daughter was working. It's terrible, but thank you for taking up this cause. She's the legislative chair of Brady, California. Sheriff Bradshaw is the sheriff of Palm Beach County. He's got a lot of experience about how the Florida law works, and we look forward to hearing from you. Ms. Kimberly Wyatt is Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for King County in Seattle, Washington. And Mr. David Koppel is the Research Director at the Independence Institute, talking about the due process issues involved with this. Mr. Hamburg, would you lead us off?
Good morning, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and distinguished members of the Judiciary Committee. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to testify at this important hearing. My name is Ron Hamburg. I'm Senior Policy Advisor for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, which is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization. In my testimony, I want to talk briefly about 3 things. First, I want to talk about risk factors for violence, including gun violence, that have been identified through research. Second, I want to talk about what we regard as the biggest concern, the use of firearms and suicides. And third, I will discuss NAMI's position on extreme risk protection orders. I'll refer to them as ERPOs, including recommendations for how they can be used effectively without violating individual rights. So just briefly to talk about risk factors for violence identified through research. The biggest risk factor that's been identified is a past history of violence, including domestic violence, a history of physical or sexual abuse, particularly in childhood. Abuse of alcohol or drugs is a significant risk factor, as are past convictions for violent misdemeanors. And then finally, delusions and paranoia, which are sometimes characteristic of psychosis. People experiencing first episodes of psychosis may particularly be at risk However, it should be noted that most people experiencing these symptoms will not act violently towards others, and particularly if they receive treatment. The biggest concern, and the bigger concern, frankly, is suicides. In 2016, nearly 45,000 people died by suicides. Suicide rates were more than 2 times higher than homicide rates. Suicides were the second leading cause of death in 2016 for young people between the ages of 10 and 24. And the Department of Veterans Affairs has reported that about 20 veterans take their lives each day. Suicides account for 60% of gun deaths in this country, and nearly half of all suicide deaths in the country are with firearms. 90% of suicide attempts with guns result in deaths. The Centers for Disease Control recently estimated that about half of all suicide deaths involve people diagnosed with mental illness, particularly depression. And they speculated that the actual rates may actually be significantly higher because many others have had mental health conditions, but may have had mental health conditions, but had not seen a mental health professional and therefore had not been diagnosed. So I want to finish up by talking about NAMI's position on extreme risk protection orders. We feel that when properly utilized, these can be potentially life-saving, particularly in preventing suicides. But to maximize their positive impact and to prevent misuse of ERPOs, we offer the following 6 recommendations. First, determinations of risk should be based on individualized assessments rather than stereotypical assumptions about specific groups of people, such as people with mental illness, that are not grounded in evidence or evidence of individual risk. For this reason, it is neither necessary or appropriate to specifically list mental illness in state or federal laws. It's about identifying people who pose risks for whatever reason. Second, as with any deprivation of personal liberty, it is very important to ensure that subjects of ERPO petitions are afforded due process protections, including notice that a petition has been filed and a hearing scheduled, the right to present evidence in one's own behalf, and the right to periodic reviews to assess whether it is necessary to continue these orders. Third, law enforcement officers assigned responsibility for removing firearms from individuals under these orders should receive training on crisis de-escalation and crisis intervention. The removal of firearms from individuals who are reluctant to give up their guns or who are in crisis can be very difficult and even potentially volatile. And protecting the safety of officers and individuals is of paramount importance. The nationally recognized Crisis Intervention Team, CIT model, is a proven best practice for training first responders and for linking those people who require mental health care with needed services and supports. Fourth, terms like red flag laws should be avoided because they suggest that a particular condition, such as mental illness, is a red flag. The unnecessary use of terminology that reinforces stigma may inadvertently drive people away from seeking help when they need it. And that's why we prefer extreme risk protection order or gun violence restraining order as the term to use. Fifth, authority to initiate petitions for ERPOs and state laws should be expanded to include health professionals. Most existing laws currently limit standing to petition to law enforcement officers and in some states family members. While we respect the importance of protecting the therapeutic alliance between health professionals and their patients, we also recognize that these professionals are best positioned to recognize crisis situations and when their patients may be at risk of harming others. And finally, resources should be available to educate key stakeholders about these orders and how to use them. This would include funding for training and technical assistance for law enforcement, lawyers, judges, health and social service providers, and family members. I have a more extensive written statement which will be part of the record. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about ERPOs and their implementation in states, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, sir. Ms. Wilcox.
Good morning. Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to come before you today to share my story. My name is Amanda Wilcox, and I'm the Legislative Chair of Brady, California, a network of grassroots chapters dedicated to ending gun violence. I have been a volunteer gun violence prevention advocate for the past 18 years. In January 2001, my daughter Laura was home on winter break from college and filling in as a receptionist at our county behavioral health clinic when a client came in and opened fire. He shot Laura 4 times at point-blank range, killing her instantly. When his rampage at the clinic and a nearby restaurant ended, 3 people lay dead, 3 were severely injured, a community was left shaken, and the world was diminished by the loss of an incredible young woman. Laura, bright and beautiful at age 19, had extraordinary capability, kindness, and spirit. She was an outstanding student, graduating as high school valedictorian, and was at the time of her death a sophomore at Haverford College and in the midst of her campaign for the student body presidency. Laura was already living a life full of service. She wanted to make a positive difference in the world. She had unlimited possibilities and the brightest of futures. After Laura's sudden death, my life and that of my husband, Nick, was turned upside down. We were in a state of extreme shock, emotional pain, and deep grief. Later, as we struggled to comprehend the circumstances of our daughter's death, we learned that the shooter's family, girlfriend, and caseworker were all worried about him. His father and grandfather had died by suicide with a firearm. They knew he had guns. The warning signs were there. But because he had never committed a crime or been subject to an involuntary mental health hold, which carries a temporary firearm prohibition under California law, there was no legal tool for removing his firearms. It was clear to us then, and it still is today, that there needs to be a way to remove firearms from a person who is in crisis, clearly dangerous, and at risk of harming themselves or others. It was too late for Laura, but my husband and I wanted to save others by working to keep guns out of dangerous hands. Since Laura's death, there have been many high-profile shootings in Tucson, Aurora, Isla Vista, Parkland, and in so many cases, there were warning signs and people were concerned. And every day, there are shootings that most of us never hear about. But in my small rural county, 4 people I know have died by suicide with a gun. And in my own little town, an elderly man with dementia shot and killed his caregiver. In so many shootings, whether suicide, domestic violence, mass or school shooting, a loved one or member of law enforcement typically sees the signs before the tragedy occurs. The Extreme Risk Protective Order law allows family members and law enforcement to petition the court for a temporary firearm prohibition when a person is at risk of injury to self or others by having a firearm. The law enables those who know the person in crisis the best, family members, or law enforcement, to intervene and save lives. My central role in the enactment and ongoing implementation of California's extreme risk law has been very meaningful to me. As had the law been in place in 2001, Laura might be alive today. Based on our experience in California, I know that extreme risk laws need to be accompanied by a thoughtful and robust implementation program that incorporates all major stakeholders, including law enforcement officers, court clerks and judges, as well as social service providers, medical professionals, and others who may be working with a potential family petitioner. A process for implementing the law in each jurisdiction needs to be developed. This takes resources. As a mother whose daughter needlessly lost her life, I ask you to support incentives and funding for states to enact and implement extreme risk laws. We can save lives every day by making extreme risk orders available throughout the country. I look forward to working with all of you on this committee to find a path forward. In 2001, Laura was killed in an instant by 4 bullets. In the aftermath, I was overwhelmed by the permanence of her death. Laura was gone forever. That is why extreme risk laws resonate with me. One can always give a gun back. I cannot get her life back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilcox. Sheriff Bradshaw.
Good morning, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Rick Bradshaw. I'm the sheriff of Palm Beach County. I've been the sheriff there for 15 years. Before that, I was the police chief in West Palm Beach. I worked there for 33 years. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to speak with you about what I believe is probably the one of the most important issue in the United States right now, and that's the high level of violence that's taken human lives. This issue has been kicked around a lot, and there's a lot of diverse opinions about it, but the violence is really either domestic violence, street violence, or what we've seen with the mass casualties, targeted violence. The recent studies indicate that the domestic violence and street violence incidences are more often the result of an impulsive or reactive situation. On the other hand, the active shooter mass casualty incidents appear to be predatory and planned, where the violence is premeditated and serves some purpose for those who plan and conduct the attacks. Another aspect of the perpetrator at some point in time displayed pre-attack behaviors or shared information that gave clues to others about their impending violence. It is incumbent upon law enforcement to continue to connect with the community and provide avenues for them to communicate information about their concerns to their respective law enforcement agencies so that information can and must be acted upon. Finally, there's a relationship between mental illness and targeted violence. It's complex and no means by absolute. To be very clear, without a doubt, all mentally ill people are not violent and do not commit violent acts. But the research has shown that those involved in these acts do have and have demonstrated intentions that are indications of their behaviors, because behaviors are clues to a person's intentions and are the foundation of any mental health diagnosis. Law enforcement must carefully consider each individual case, assessing the impact of that mental illness that may have on the person involved and taking the appropriate action. Law enforcement must educate and must train its personnel in mental health issues and employ mental health professionals to be part of the risk assessment teams. Once a person or persons have been identified as a personal and potential risk and may be involved in a violent act and may be in possession of firearms or likely to purchase one, then the use of the risk protection order appears to be a valuable tool. And I stress that phrase, tool. It's not the end all. Our goal here is to identify people that have the potentiality to perform these violent acts. Because it could be a car, it could be a rock, it could be a knife, it could be a pressure cooker. So sometimes it's not the instrument, it's the hands of who you put this instrument in. My testimony today will be discussing how the Sheriff's Office has developed a strategy, a special unit called the Behavioral Science Division to address these issues. I think the most important thing to realize is we cannot arrest our way out of this situation. Prevention, intervention are the key factors to resolving this issue. Having such a unit as the Behavioral Science Division with the capabilities of using that risk protection order and the mental health professionals attached to it will reach these goals. I've submitted a larger statement that details our program, the interventions, and our success stories. It's about prevention. It's not about the gun taking. We want to identify these individuals, get them the help they need before they commit these violent acts. I look forward to your questions and the discussion going forward. Thank you.
Ms. Wyatt.
Good morning, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and distinguished members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your leadership on this critical life-saving tool, extreme risk protection orders. My name is Kim Wyatt. I am a senior deputy prosecuting attorney from King County, Washington. For the past year, I have served as a firearms prosecutor in the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit, specifically as the Extreme Risk Protection Order prosecutor. My responsibilities are to advise and assist law enforcement and family members on all aspects of extreme risk protection orders, from the petitions to the court proceedings. And I can tell you this has been some of the most important and rewarding work of my career. You see, as a prosecutor, rarely, if ever, do we get the opportunity to intervene prior to the gun violence occurring. Instead, we react. We receive that incident report after the crime has occurred. My colleagues and I know we have few brief windows of opportunity to intervene to prevent future harm. This life-saving legislation creates one of those opportunities and allows much-needed intervention to prevent suicide, homicide, and other acts of community violence, while at the same time protecting people's constitutional rights with due process built in. Red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders allow family members and law enforcement who have seen those warning signs to come before a court and petition for a temporary order that prevents the at-risk individual from purchasing and possessing firearms. In 2016, Washington state voters overwhelmingly approved a citizens' initiative for our extreme risk protection order, passing by 69% of the vote. To understand what we've been doing in our state and the cases that I see every day, I need to tell you about some of the stories. These are stories of people who are at their lowest and most vulnerable points of life. The first story I want to share with you is about a case that we believe prevented a suicide. A woman filed an extreme risk protection order against her boyfriend as he had recently tried to commit suicide and wanted to purchase a firearm. At the extreme risk protection order hearing, they came in together. In fact, they were holding hands. The boyfriend or respondent had no objection to the extreme risk protection order, and in fact expressed gratitude that somebody cared enough to make sure that he did not have access to a gun while he was in a crisis. We've also dealt with cases involving crimes of violence. Recently in the